The British Empire is gone. The tactics it used to run a quarter of the planet are not. At its peak, Britain controlled over 400 million people across every continent on Earth. It did this with a surprisingly small number of actual British personnel on the ground. What it had instead was a set of governing tools so effective, so transferable, and so deeply embedded into the institutions it left behind that they kept working long after the empire itself collapsed. These were not crude methods. They were refined over centuries of trial, failure, and adjustment across dozens of different countries and cultures. They were tested on resistant populations, revised when they failed, and perfected when they worked. By the time the British Empire ended, it had produced a complete manual for how to control large numbers of people at minimal cost. That manual was never formally handed over. It did not need to be. It was already built into the borders, the laws, the armies, the education systems, and the economic structures of almost every country Britain ever touched. Tactic 1: Divide and rule. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the entire planet at its peak. It governed hundreds of millions of people across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And it did all of this with a surprisingly small number of British officials on the ground. In India, the entire colonial administration never exceeded around 15,000 British personnel managing over 300 million people. The question is how? One answer sits above everything else: divide and rule. The strategy is older than Britain itself. The Roman Empire used it to conquer and hold territory across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Julius Caesar applied it during his conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE, deliberately playing rival tribes against each other to prevent them from forming a coalition powerful enough to push him out. The Romans even had a Latin phrase for it: divide et impera, divide and govern. When the British built their empire, they picked this tactic up and turned it into institutional policy. Lord Elphinstone, the British governor of Bombay, made the approach explicit in 1857 when he wrote that divide et impera was the old Roman maxim, and it should be theirs too. He was not describing something that had happened accidentally. He was describing a deliberate governing philosophy. In India, the British applied it with precision. Before British rule arrived, the country was not a single unified nation, but it was also not the violently divided place it would become. Hindu and Muslim communities lived in close proximity, shared festivals, and fought together against the British during the 1857 rebellion that nearly ended company rule. That rebellion, in which both communities united under a single cause, terrified British administrators. After suppressing it, the colonial government made a calculated decision to ensure it never happened again. The tool they used was law. In the 19th century, the British created a system of separate personal laws for each religious community in India. Hindus had their own legal code governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Muslims had a separate one. Parsis had another. Before this system was imposed, such distinctions existed socially, but were not enforced by the state. The British codified them, gave them legal weight, and made religious identity a formal category that the government tracked, measured, and administered differently. Many historians argue that the rigid modern form of the Hindu caste system was largely solidified through this process. Social differences that once had room to breathe were frozen in place by colonial bureaucracy. The most direct political application came in 1909. The British Parliament passed the Indian Councils Act, better known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. The act introduced separate electorates for Muslim voters, carving out distinct constituencies organized along religious lines for the first time in Indian political history. Muslim voters would choose Muslim representatives. Hindu voters would choose from a separate pool. The stated purpose was administrative representation. The actual function was to structurally separate the two communities inside the political system itself, ensuring that the Indian nationalist movement could not build a unified front. It worked. By the time the British left India in 1947, the divisions were deep enough that the country could not be handed over as one nation. The partition that followed drew a border through the subcontinent in under 5 weeks, assigned to a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never set foot in India before the job and never returned after it. The resulting violence killed somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people by various estimates. Around 10 to 20 million more were displaced in the largest forced population movement in recorded history. Kashmir, where 3 full-scale wars and a frozen conflict have unfolded since 1947, remains a direct product of the ambiguities and fractures that British policy deliberately engineered. The British were not the only ones to use this playbook. Belgium ran the same strategy in Rwanda-Urundi, the territory that became Rwanda and Burundi. The Hutu and Tutsi distinction had existed as a loose social category before Belgian colonial rule. The Belgians turned it into a legal racial classification, issued identity cards labeling every individual, and systematically privileged one group over the other to maintain control. When Belgium withdrew, the classification system stayed. In 1994, it contributed directly to a genocide that killed more than 800,000 people in approximately 100 days. The Ottoman Empire used the same logic to set Christian Armenians and Muslim Kurds against each other in the late 19th century. The manufactured tensions fed into the conditions that produced the Armenian genocide during the First World War. What makes this tactic so persistent is that it does not need to be actively managed once it is set in motion. The British created legal structures, administrative categories, and institutional separations that outlasted the empire itself. The governments that inherited those structures often maintained them because they were the only administrative architecture available. And the communities that had been defined against each other by colonial law carried those definitions forward into independence, into politics, into violence. In 2008, a RAND Corporation study produced for the U.S. Armed Forces formally recommended considering divide and rule as a strategic option in what American military planners called the Long War, specifically through deepening the Sunni-Shia divide across the Muslim world. The vocabulary had changed. The logic had not moved an inch from what Lord Elphinstone wrote in 1857. Divide and rule did not die when the British Empire did. It was passed down as a blueprint, and the borders, legal categories, and institutional divisions left behind are still producing conflicts that governments call modern problems with modern causes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Those borders are the next part of this story. Because the British did not just divide communities, they drew the lines between nations, and those lines were drawn with the same lack of concern for the people living inside them. Tactic 2: Indirect rule through local proxies. At its peak, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed over 400 million people. The entire British civil service managing India never exceeded around 15,000 personnel. In Africa, a single British district officer could be responsible for a territory the size of an English county, containing tens of thousands of people who spoke languages he did not understand, followed customs he had never studied, and owed him no natural loyalty whatsoever. The numbers simply did not add up for direct control. So the British built a system that did not require it. The system was called indirect rule. Instead of replacing existing local power structures, the British kept them in place and worked through them. Kings, chiefs, emirs, and sultans retained their titles, their courts, and their daily authority over the populations they had governed before the British arrived. What they lost was control over external affairs, taxation policy, military decisions, and anything the British considered strategically important. A small number of British advisors sat behind the scenes with effective veto power over every significant decision. The local ruler governed, the British officer governed the ruler. The man most associated with turning this into formal doctrine was Frederick Lugard. Lugard had served in Uganda and East Africa before being appointed to govern northern Nigeria at the turn of the 20th century. He inherited a vast territory organized around the Fulani Emirates, powerful, centralized Islamic states with sophisticated administrative systems already in place. Rather than dismantle them, Lugard worked through them. The emirs collected taxes, maintained order, and administered daily life. The British took a portion of the revenue, held military authority, and supervised from a distance. Lugard later summarized his governing philosophy in 3 words: decentralization, continuity, and cooperation. He was direct about the logic. A colonial official should consider it as irregular to issue direct orders to a native subject as a general would to a private soldier without going through the command structure. The local ruler was the command structure. The British officer was the power behind it. In areas where no such centralized structure existed, the British invented one. In southeastern Nigeria, communities had traditionally governed themselves through councils and consensus rather than chiefs. This was administratively inconvenient for indirect rule, which required a single identifiable authority to work through. So British officials simply appointed individuals and designated them warrant chiefs, granting authority through colonial decree, regardless of whether that authority had any legitimacy within the community. These men derived their power entirely from British recognition. They collected taxes, enforced British demands, and bore the resentment of the people they nominally led. The British remained invisible. The financial logic of indirect rule was inseparable from its political logic. Britain was not prepared to pay for full colonial administration across territories covering millions of square kilometers. Indirect rule allowed the empire to extract taxes, maintain order, and project power at a fraction of what direct governance would have cost. As British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury explained in 1890 when discussing protectorates, indirect rule was cheaper, simpler, and spared unnecessary contact between colonial subjects and the British themselves. The system had a deliberately conservative bias built into it. Because the British worked through existing hierarchies, they reinforced the authority of traditional elders and rulers against the educated younger generation emerging from colonial schools. British policy actually favored rulers who were, in Lugard's framework, less modernized, because educated subjects with Western ideas about rights and self-governance were harder to manage through proxy structures. This created a structural resentment that would drive post-colonial instability for decades. The educated class knew more than the chiefs the British had installed above them. The chiefs knew their authority depended on colonial recognition rather than popular legitimacy. When independence came across Africa and Asia in the mid-20th century, the colonial proxy structures did not simply disappear. In most cases, the new governments inherited the institutional architecture the British had built. The armies of Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Zambia were all formed directly from the King's African Rifles and the West African Frontier Force, colonial units built by the British, officered by the British, and passed wholesale to independence governments. The rank and file were drawn from specific ethnic groups the British had designated as martial races, creating officer corps that were ethnically unrepresentative of the broader populations they were supposed to serve. Research published through Stanford University documents that the ethnic imbalances the British engineered in these colonial forces directly predicted which post-independence governments experienced military coups. The intelligence infrastructure followed the same path. MI5, Britain's domestic and imperial security service, maintained security liaison officers in newly independent countries for years after formal decolonization. When India gained independence in 1947, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru agreed to keep an MI5 liaison officer in New Delhi. When Ghana became independent in 1957, the first president, Kwame Nkrumah, asked the British security liaison officer to remain. The faces of governance changed. The underlying architecture of surveillance and intelligence sharing did not. This pattern has a modern name. Kwame Nkrumah himself coined it in 1965, neocolonialism. Formal sovereignty exists on paper. The structural relationships through which external powers exercise influence continue operating underneath. The local ruler governs, the external power governs the conditions under which the ruler operates. Today, the same logic appears in how major powers engage with smaller states. Military advisors embedded in foreign armies, aid conditioned on governance decisions, intelligence sharing agreements that tie local security services into external networks. The local leader makes the announcement. Someone else determines the options available to them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Indirect rule was never really about the past. It was a template. And nowhere did the British apply that template more consequentially than in the way they physically drew the map of the world. A process so arbitrary and so careless that its results are still being fought over with weapons today. Tactic 3. Strategic border drawing. In 1893, a British diplomat named Mortimer Durand was sent to Afghanistan to negotiate a border. The meeting produced a single page of text. The Afghan emir, Abdur Rahman Khan, could not read or speak English. The definitive copy of the agreement was written in English. The line Durand drew split the Pashtun tribal lands directly down the middle, separating communities, families, and trade routes that had functioned as a single connected territory for centuries. That line, the Durand Line, is today the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It has never been accepted by Afghanistan as legitimate. It has been a source of tension, insurgency, and cross-border conflict ever since. This was not an isolated incident. It was a method. One academic study calculated that Britain and France together traced nearly 40% of the entire length of today's international boundaries across the world. The majority of those lines were drawn between the 1880s and the 1960s, during the period when European powers carved up Africa, Asia, and the Middle East among themselves. The borders were determined by what the colonial powers needed strategically, not by where communities, languages, religions, or trade routes actually ended and began. Africa is where the consequences are most visible. At the 1884 Berlin Conference, European powers gathered without a single African representative present and divided the continent into colonial territories. The lines they drew followed rivers, degrees of latitude, and negotiating compromises between rival European governments. They did not follow the ethnic and linguistic boundaries that had organized African life for generations. Communities that had operated as unified peoples were split across multiple colonial territories. Rival communities that had historically maintained distance from each other were enclosed within the same administrative unit and told they now shared a nation. In Sudan, the British created a single administrative territory, despite stark and well-documented divisions between the Muslim North and the Christian and animist South. That imposed unity produced decades of civil war after independence. South Sudan finally separated in 2011, becoming the world's newest country. Internal conflicts within South Sudan continue to reflect the colonial administrative boundaries that were drawn without regard for the people enclosed within them. Nigeria was assembled from three distinct Ottoman-style territories: North, Southwest, and Southeast, containing hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups with no shared history of unified governance. The British amalgamated them in 1914, primarily for administrative and economic convenience. The tensions between these communities, particularly between the largely Muslim North and the Christian South, have produced military coups, a civil war between 1967 and 1970 that killed between 1 and 3 million people, and persistent instability that continues into the present. In the Middle East, Britain's border drawing carried an additional layer of deliberate calculation. During World War I, Britain and France negotiated the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, dividing the Arab territories of the collapsing Ottoman Empire between them before those territories had been fully conquered. The agreement drew lines across a map of a region neither diplomat had comprehensively surveyed. It created the borders that became Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. Iraq was constructed by combining three former Ottoman provinces: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, containing Arab Sunnis, Arab Shias, and Kurds with distinct histories, competing interests, and no tradition of shared statehood. The sectarian conflict that has defined Iraqi politics since the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003 is directly traceable to this colonial construction. Palestine carries the most documented consequences of British border promises. The 1917 Balfour Declaration saw Britain express support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine while Palestine was still under Ottoman control. Britain had no legal authority over the territory at the time the declaration was made. The promise created competing and irreconcilable claims to the same land that have produced continuous conflict for over a century. As one Indian news analysis stated plainly, Britain had no authority to promise such a thing, yet did so anyway as part of its wartime strategic calculations. In South Asia, the partition line drawn by Cyril Radcliffe in 1947 produced Kashmir, a territory with a Muslim-majority population ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, positioned on the border between two newly created states, both of which claimed it. The British gave the princely states the theoretical right to choose which country to join without adequately considering what would happen when that choice was genuinely contested. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars, by various counts, over Kashmir. The conflict remains one of the most militarized borders on Earth. The India-China border dispute adds another layer. British cartographers drew the McMahon Line in 1914, purportedly defining the boundary between British India and Tibet. China has never recognized it as legitimate. The line runs through terrain that was never comprehensively surveyed. As historian Kyle Gardner has documented, British officials transformed the Himalayan region from a crossroads of trade into a series of contested linear frontiers in a landscape that those linear concepts were never suited for. The 1962 Sino-Indian War was fought partly over these colonial cartographic legacies. Border confrontations continue to occur in the same zones today. Thomas Holditch, appointed Superintendent of Frontier Surveys in British India in 1892, acknowledged in his own writings that colonial border agreements suffered from systematic geographical ignorance that would produce unnecessary conflict. He was describing a problem he was personally contributing to. The British knew the lines were imprecise. They drew them anyway, because the priority was administrative convenience and strategic advantage, not long-term stability for the populations enclosed within them. The borders of the modern world are not ancient facts. Most of them are 20th century administrative decisions made by foreign officials with limited knowledge and no accountability to the people affected. Every time a government today justifies military action, economic pressure, or political intervention by referencing national borders, it is often enforcing lines that were drawn by someone else in someone else's interest less than a century ago. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding who drew those borders and why changes how every conflict built on top of them has to be read. And the British did not stop at borders. They also built the intelligence systems to watch what was happening inside every territory they controlled. Systems whose direct descendants are still operational today. Tactic 4: Intelligence and Mass Surveillance. In 1934, MI5's deputy head, Sir Eric Holt Wilson, made a statement that revealed exactly how the British understood their intelligence apparatus. He said the security service was more than national. It was imperial. It had official agencies cooperating under the direct instructions of the dominions and colonial offices, supervised by local governors and chiefs of police, enforcing security laws in every British community overseas. All of them, he said, acted under MI5's guidance for security duties. He was describing a surveillance network that spanned a quarter of the planet. MI5 itself was founded in 1909, created as the home section of the Secret Service Bureau through a joint initiative of the Admiralty and the War Office. Its original focus was German imperial activity, but from its earliest years, the service's remit extended across the empire. As Britain's colonies became increasingly restless in the 20th century, monitoring, infiltrating, and neutralizing political movements inside those colonies became central to what MI5 actually did. The architecture was built outward from London. In 1937, MI5 posted its first permanent defense security officer to Cairo. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, MI5 had permanent officers stationed at Gibraltar, Malta, Cairo, and Aden. As the war progressed and colonial unrest accelerated, the network expanded rapidly across the Caribbean, South Asia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. Each posting followed the same model: a British intelligence officer embedded within the local colonial administration, tasked with monitoring political activity, identifying threats to British rule, and coordinating with local police forces who acted under MI5 direction. The targets were not foreign spies. They were political organizers. Kwame Nkrumah, who would become the first president of Ghana, had his correspondence and telephone calls monitored by MI5 while he was living in Britain before independence. Jomo Kenyatta, who would become the first prime minister and president of Kenya, received the same treatment. MI5 assessed both men and concluded there was no evidence of communism as it was understood in Europe in either West or East Africa. They monitored them anyway because political independence itself was treated as a security threat to British interests. The domestic side of MI5's operations followed the same logic. David Cott's research, based on National Archives releases, documents that MI5 surveillance throughout the 20th century targeted left-wing academics, journalists, lawyers, members of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and cultural figures who expressed sympathy for colonial independence movements. All correspondence to and from the Communist Party's London headquarters was opened and read by Special Branch. Spies were routinely placed inside the organization. One agent, Olga Gray, spent 6 years embedded within the party's inner circles, ultimately providing information that led directly to the imprisonment of its members. MI5 considered this operation the textbook example of what it called a deep swimmer, an agent embedded so thoroughly in a target organization that they became, as the files described it, a piece of the furniture. The connection between colonial surveillance and domestic surveillance was not coincidental. It was structural. Historian David Cott explicitly documented what he called MI5's enduring commitment to empire, and the inextricable link between how Britain watched its colonies and how it watched dissent at home. Senior figures in the security state had direct personal experience administering colonial repression. Guy Liddell, who ran MI5 counterespionage throughout World War II, came from the Metropolitan Police's Special Branch, which had been originally established to combat Irish republicanism. The methods developed to monitor and suppress colonial subjects were imported directly into domestic political policing. When independence came, the surveillance network did not shut down. It transformed. MI5 maintained security liaison officers in newly independent countries for years after formal decolonization. When India became independent in 1947, the new government of Jawaharlal Nehru agreed to keep an MI5 officer in New Delhi. The arrangement continued for close to a quarter of a century. When Ghana became independent in 1957, Nkrumah, the man whose phone calls MI5 had tapped while he lived in Britain, asked the British security liaison officer to stay on, and even sent a formal letter of thanks to MI5's Director General when that officer's term was extended. The signals intelligence operation ran parallel to the human intelligence network. GCHQ, Britain's Signals Intelligence Agency, and the equivalent of the American National Security Agency, assumed responsibility for signals intelligence across the 54 nations of the Commonwealth after decolonization. This arrangement, documented in sources examining post-colonial British intelligence architecture, was funded substantially by the Americans and embedded GCHQ's reach into the communications infrastructure of countries that had formally ended British rule. In 2013, documents released by Edward Snowden revealed that GCHQ was operating a program called Tempora, a mass internet surveillance system that collected and stored vast quantities of online communications data. The program was not a new invention born from the digital age. It was the technological extension of a surveillance philosophy that MI5's deputy head had articulated in 1934. The scale changed, the intent did not. The BBC itself was not exempt from this system. Despite decades of public denials, declassified documents confirm that thousands of job roles at the BBC were subject to political vetting by MI5 and MI6. Britain's Information Research Department, a covert Cold War propaganda unit, had a specific BBC operations desk that provided material directly to the World Service. The line between state broadcaster and state instrument was, in practice, thinner than publicly acknowledged. What the British built was not just a spy network, it was a model. The idea that a government's security apparatus should extend beyond its own borders, monitor political thought rather than just criminal activity, and treat the expression of dissent as a threat equivalent to foreign aggression. Every surveillance state that operates on those principles today is working from a template the British refined across more than a century of imperial practice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But watching populations was only part of the architecture. When surveillance identified resistance movements that could not be monitored into submission, the British had a separate toolkit ready. One built around laws that could suspend every legal protection a person theoretically held. Tactic 5. Emergency laws and detention without trial. In 1818, the British colonial government in Bengal passed a regulation that would become one of the most consequential legal templates in modern history. The Bengal State Prisoners Regulation allowed the colonial administration to detain any individual without trial, without charge, and without any requirement to produce evidence, as long as authorities determined that the security of British dominion from foreign hostility or internal disturbance was at stake. No court approval was required. No time limit was specified. The detained person had no right of appeal. That single regulation from 1818 is the direct ancestor of preventive detention laws that exist in dozens of countries today. The British did not invent detention without trial as a concept, but they built it into a transferable legal architecture, a system of laws, regulations, and emergency powers that could be activated quickly, justified through elastic security language, and suspended the normal protections of the legal system without formally abolishing them. The genius of the British approach was that it maintained the appearance of legality while gutting its substance. The law itself created the mechanism for suspending the law. The 1857 Indian Rebellion accelerated this process dramatically. After suppressing the uprising, the colonial government passed a cascade of new emergency legislation within the same year. The 1857 State Offences Act allowed local officials to formally proclaim states of rebellion. The 1857 Military and State Offences Act permitted trials by court-martial rather than civilian courts. The 1858 State Prisoners Act extended and formalized the detention powers first codified in 1818. Each piece of legislation built on the last, creating a layered emergency legal system that was more comprehensive, more flexible, and harder to challenge than what existed before. The pattern repeated itself every time the British faced serious resistance anywhere in the empire. In Ireland, the British passed the Insurrection Act of 1796 in response to United Irishmen organizing. The act imposed the death penalty on persons administering illegal oaths, allowed authorities to declare states of disturbance in specific districts, suspended trial by jury in those districts, and expanded police powers of search and detention. Between 1807 and 1833, Ireland saw multiple additional insurrection acts and coercion acts that gave authorities emergency powers in proclaimed areas. Further legislation between 1848 and 1871 explicitly authorized detention without trial for anyone suspected of plotting rebellion. Habeas corpus, the legal right requiring the state to justify imprisonment before a court, was suspended in Ireland repeatedly throughout the 19th century as a routine governing tool. The most expansive emergency legal framework in British imperial history came during World War I. In August 1914, Parliament passed the Defence of the Realm Act, known as DORA. Its sixth edition, issued in August 1918, ran to more than 600 pages. DORA authorized control over population movement, internal removal and expulsion of individuals, extended powers of search and arrest, surveillance, and banning of public meetings and assemblies, and restrictions on freedom of expression and communication. The measures were applied not just in Britain, but simultaneously across the empire. In India, the colonial government passed a direct equivalent called the Defence of India Act in March 1915. Like its British counterpart, it allowed the Governor-General to make rules for securing public safety and the defense of British India, empowered authorities to imprison or detain anyone deemed a threat, and applied across the entire subcontinent. In Ireland, the DORA regulations were used to authorize the detention of thousands of suspected Sinn Féin members. In Egypt, nationalist protests were met with collective punishment in which hundreds were killed. In Sudan, martial law had been in continuous operation since the British conquest of 1898. The most significant single regulation produced by this wartime legal expansion was DRR 14B, enacted by the British Cabinet on June 10, 1915. It gave the Home Secretary the power to order the arrest and indefinite detention of any person of hostile origin or association, including British subjects born and raised in Britain, without trial and without any judicial oversight. The final decision rested with the Home Secretary alone. The recommendation for arrest came from military authorities. The courts had no role. Habeas corpus was effectively suspended for any individual the executive chose to designate as a threat. When challenged in Parliament, Home Secretary John Simon defended the regulation by arguing that no strict legal line should be drawn between naturalized and natural-born citizens when security was at stake. The argument established a precedent. Emergency conditions could override the formal legal distinctions that normally defined what the state could and could not do to its own people. After the war, the Indian colonial government passed the Rowlatt Act of 1919, officially the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act, which extended emergency detention powers into peacetime. The act allowed arrest and detention of anyone suspected of anti-colonial activity without trial and without charge for up to 2 years. Gandhi called it the Black Act. Its passage triggered the mass protests that led directly to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar in April 1919, when British troops under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer opened fire on a crowd of unarmed civilians in an enclosed garden, killing at minimum 379 people, according to the official British inquiry, with Indian National Congress estimates placing the figure significantly higher. When India became independent in 1947, the new government inherited the emergency legal framework the British had built. The Preventive Detention Act of 1950, passed by the newly independent Indian state, drew directly from colonial-era laws. It allowed detention without trial for up to 3 months with periodic review. During the emergency of 1975 to 1977, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi used preventive detention legislation descended from these colonial statutes to imprison political opponents and suppress civil liberties across the country. The same inheritance appeared across former British territories. Kenya's post-independence emergency powers legislation showed direct legal continuity with the colonial statutes used during the Mau Mau suppression of the 1950s. The laws that locked up independence activists became the laws that post-colonial governments used to lock up their own political opponents. Emergency law is one of the most durable exports the British Empire produced. It gave governments everywhere a legal method for doing things that normal law explicitly prohibited, wrapped in language about security and necessity that made those actions appear legitimate. Suspending the rules while claiming to uphold them is a skill that required decades of colonial practice to perfect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And when emergency laws alone were not enough to maintain control, the British had something else ready: a campaign to reshape the minds of the people they governed, starting with the children. Tactic 6: the civilizing mission and cultural imperialism. In 1835, a British politician and historian named Thomas Babington Macaulay sat down in Calcutta and wrote a document that would reshape an entire civilization. He called it the Minute on Indian Education. In it, he argued that all the historical information contained in Sanskrit and Arabic literature was less valuable than what could be found in a single shelf of a good European library. He had not read Sanskrit. He had not studied Arabic. He stated this openly and without embarrassment, and then used it as the justification for one of the most consequential acts of cultural engineering the modern world has seen. Macaulay's goal was specific. He wanted to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The purpose was not generosity. The British administration in India was expanding faster than Britain could staff it with people from home. Macaulay's solution was to manufacture a local administrative class that would think, reason, and govern like the British. People who would serve as interpreters between the colonial government and the hundreds of millions of Indians it could never directly reach. Education was the production line for colonial collaborators. The Minute on Education became policy. English replaced Persian and Sanskrit as the medium of higher education in India. The colonial government funded schools that taught British history, British literature, British law, and British values. Indigenous knowledge systems, the vast corpus of Sanskrit scientific, mathematical, philosophical, and literary work, were formally relegated to irrelevance within the state education framework. Students who wanted government employment, social advancement, or access to the colonial economy learned to navigate a world where their own intellectual heritage had been officially classified as backward. This was not presented as conquest, it was presented as a gift. The ideological packaging around this project was called the Civilizing Mission. The argument, deployed consistently across British colonial territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, was that European colonization was a moral obligation. The colonized peoples were described as backward, primitive, or insufficiently developed to govern themselves. The British were not taking, they were giving. They were bringing order, Christianity, education, and progress to peoples who lacked it. As the National Portrait Gallery in London documents in its analysis of British imperial imagery, the civilizing mission framing presented the empire as a force for good, a representation that required significant propaganda effort to maintain against the visible realities of extraction and violence. In practice, the civilizing mission education system served four functions simultaneously. It created the administrative workforce the empire needed without paying British salaries. It produced people whose cultural orientation made them more likely to identify with British interests than with the populations they came from. It systematically devalued indigenous knowledge, weakening cultural cohesion and making resistance harder to organize around shared identity. And it established English as the language of power, commerce, and opportunity, a structural advantage that persisted long after the British left. In Africa, the Colonial Film Unit operationalized the civilizing mission through mobile cinema. From the 1930s through the 1950s, cinema vans drove into villages across Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanganyika, today's Tanzania, showing films produced by the colonial government. The films covered child welfare, agricultural methods, and scenes of Africans living and working in Britain. As documented by researchers at the University of Lincoln, the unit's producer, William Sellers, referred to its rural African audiences as primitive peoples and designed the films around what he assumed were their limited intellectual capabilities. The seating at film shows was arranged according to traditional hierarchies, reinforcing existing social structures rather than disrupting them. The films were a tool for defining what colonial citizenship looked like and making the colonial government appear benevolent and modern. The civilizing mission extended to sport. The British spread cricket, football, and rugby across their empire deliberately, partly as a way of encoding British values, fair play, discipline, deference to rules, into colonial populations. As Wikipedia's analysis of cultural imperialism documents, British sports were spread across the empire as a way of encouraging British values and cultural uniformity. Test cricket was specifically framed as a sport that carried inherent values of civilizedness, with the British as its natural originators and arbiters. The colonized peoples who eventually beat Britain at its own games turned those defeats into expressions of national pride, a dynamic British imperialist had not fully anticipated. The long-term psychological effects of the civilizing mission education system have been extensively documented by post-colonial scholars. Edward Said's foundational work on cultural imperialism argued that the British Empire's power to export its fundamental ideas and concepts in the 19th century had no rivals, that it shaped not just the territories it governed, but the cultural and political frameworks through which those territories understood themselves long after independence. The preference for Western education systems, Western legal frameworks, Western economic models, and the English language in former colonies is not natural. It is the residue of a deliberate campaign to make those things feel natural. Macaulay's manufactured class of colonial administrators did not disappear when independence came. The educated elites who inherited post-colonial governments were largely products of British educational institutions, British cultural formation, and British administrative training. They governed using British legal codes, British bureaucratic structures, and often British values about what modernization meant. The civilizing mission succeeded so thoroughly that its products could not easily imagine governing otherwise. Today, governments that condition foreign aid on educational reform, that fund cultural exchange programs to spread their values abroad, that establish internationally branded universities in developing countries, and that export their legal and administrative models as prerequisites for economic partnership, are working from the same basic logic Macaulay wrote down in 1835. The language of development has replaced the language of civilization. The structure of the relationship has not changed nearly as much as the vocabulary suggests. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The civilizing mission shaped minds, but the British also understood that controlling what people believed required more than schools. It required controlling what they heard, what they read, and what version of reality reached them at all, which is where the next tactic begins. Tactic 7: Propaganda and Information Control. During World War II, Britain managed to convince much of the world that it had a free, honest, and independent press, while simultaneously running one of the most sophisticated state information control systems in modern history. The government controlled and censored the content of news, while leaving the packaging, commentary, and presentation to existing outlets, chiefly radio, newspapers, and newsreel films. The population never felt they were being managed, because the management was invisible. The BBC reported the news. The government determined which news existed to be reported. George Orwell noticed. He wrote that the BBC had gained enormous prestige since around 1940, and that hearing it on the radio had become almost equivalent to knowing something was true. That reputation for honesty was itself a propaganda achievement, the most effective kind, because it was believed by the people consuming it. The British government's approach to propaganda was built on a specific insight. Overt manipulation produces resistance. People who feel they are being told what to think push back. The more effective method was to shape the information environment so completely that the conclusions the government wanted people to reach appeared to be the only reasonable conclusions available. This required controlling not just what was said, but what was knowable. The infrastructure for this had been developing since World War I. When Britain entered that war in 1914, it had no established propaganda organization. Within months, it had built one. Wellington House, established in late 1914, produced hundreds of pamphlets targeted at foreign audiences, particularly American elites whose support Britain needed. The pamphlets were deliberately designed to look boring. Plain covers, dense text, no emotional imagery. As documented by historian Rebecca Berens-Matzke, the bland presentation was intentional. The educated American audience being targeted would feel manipulated by overtly emotional appeals. So the propaganda was disguised as sober analysis. It was information designed to look like it was not designed. In the colonies, the approach was more direct because the audience had less power to push back. The Colonial Film Unit, operating from the 1930s through the 1950s, produced government films shown to African audiences through mobile cinema vans. As documented in analyses of the unit's operations, the films were made using specific production techniques, avoiding close-ups, limiting fast editing, restricting movement within the frame, based on British officials' assumptions about what rural African audiences could process. The films promoted British agricultural methods, British Administrative Authority, and British Benevolence. They were not presented as government messaging. They were presented as information and education. When colonial audiences resisted, the resistance was instructive. At the height of the Malayan emergency in the 1950s, the colonial government cancelled screenings of a propaganda film after reports that cinema audiences had cheered for communist leader Chin Peng when he appeared on screen. In Nyasaland, nationalist leaders physically blocked mobile cinema units from reaching villages. In Ghana, a lamp was fitted to the projection screen specifically to illuminate political dissidents in the audience. The British were monitoring the reaction to their own propaganda in real time and adjusting accordingly. The most significant post-war propaganda operation was one the British public did not know existed for decades. The Information Research Department, known as the IRD, was established in 1948 as a covert Foreign Office unit tasked with producing anti-communist propaganda during the Cold War. It operated for nearly 30 years before being disbanded in 1977. The IRD placed articles in foreign newspapers, funded books and publications, and supplied material to journalists, academics, and broadcasters who did not always know the source of what they were receiving. It had a specific BBC operations desk that provided content directly to the World Service. Despite decades of public denial, declassified documents confirmed that thousands of BBC job roles were subject to MI5 political vetting during the same period the IRD was operating its BBC desk. The IRD also worked extensively in Britain's remaining colonies and former territories. It employed academics who specialized in Asian and African affairs to produce material framing independence movements as communist threats. One key figure, Guy Wint, was described in internal documents as the IRD's chief Asian academic and had authorized access to the IRD's research desks while working as an editorial writer for the Manchester Guardian. The boundary between independent journalism and covert state messaging was, in multiple documented cases, non-existent. Britain's wartime propaganda in the colonies carried a specific contradiction that its own officials recognized. The government was simultaneously asking colonial subjects to fight and die for the empire while producing messaging about freedom, democracy, and resistance to tyranny. Officials at the Colonial Office privately worried that encouraging Africans to hate Nazi Germany's racism might lead them to direct similar feelings toward British colonialism. The propaganda had to perform a careful balancing act, promoting Allied values loudly enough to motivate colonial soldiers, while keeping the logical implications of those values away from the populations being asked to serve. The Ministry of Information tracked public morale throughout the war using mass observation techniques. Systematic opinion sampling developed from 1937 onward. The British government was measuring what its own population believed, mapping the distance between public opinion and official messaging, and adjusting its communications accordingly. This was not public relations in any casual sense. It was a feedback loop between state messaging and population psychology, operating continuously throughout the war. What the British built was a model of information control that did not require censorship in its crudest form. It required owning the channels, embedding trusted voices inside independent institutions, making state-produced content indistinguishable from independent analysis, and monitoring public reaction closely enough to correct course when the messaging drifted from its intended effect. Every government communications operation, every embedded journalist program, every state-funded international broadcaster, and every covert influence campaign running today is working from variations of this architecture. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Controlling what people believed kept the population manageable. But the British also understood that beliefs alone do not sustain an empire. Money does. And the system they built to extract wealth from their colonies was as carefully engineered as anything they built to control mines. Tactic 8: Economic extraction and structural dependency. Between 1765 and 1938, the British extracted an estimated $45 trillion worth of wealth from India. That figure comes from Indian economist Utsa Patnaik, whose calculation was based on detailed trade and financial records spanning 173 years of colonial rule. To put it in context, $45 trillion is larger than the combined current GDP of every country in the European Union. It left India, one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth at the beginning of British rule, among the poorest nations in the world by the time independence arrived in 1947. This did not happen through war alone. It happened through a system. The economic architecture the British built across their empire had one organizing principle. Colonies existed to supply raw materials and consume manufactured goods, not to develop, not to industrialize, not to accumulate wealth for their own populations. The colony produced the inputs. Britain processed them, added value, and sold the finished products back, including to the colony itself. The structural relationship ensured that wealth flowed in one direction, regardless of how hard colonial populations worked or how abundant their natural resources were. In India, the mechanism was called the home charges. These were official transfers of funds from the Indian colonial government to Britain, running continuously from 1858 to 1947. The charges covered debt service on loans Britain had taken out and then charged to India, pensions for British civil servants who had worked in India, expenses of the India office in London, and purchases of military equipment. Indian tax revenue paid for the administration of its own subjugation. Economic historian Angus Maddison concluded in his research that there was a substantial outflow which lasted for 190 years, and that if those funds had been invested inside India, they could have made a significant contribution to raising income levels. By the late 19th century, India was the largest single purchaser of British exports, a major employer of British civil servants at high salaries, the provider of half of the empire's military strength, all paid for from Indian tax revenues, and a significant recipient of British capital investment. Britain collected both ends of the transaction. India paid for its own occupation, and then purchased the goods that occupation prevented it from producing itself. The infrastructure the British built in India and across Africa reflected this logic exactly. Colonial railways did not connect Indian cities to each other to build internal trade networks. They connected raw material producing regions to ports for export. Roads ran from plantations and mines to coastal shipping centers. As documented in analyses of colonial economic infrastructure, these networks serve the empire's commercial goals and not local development. They built an economy oriented outward toward Britain rather than inward toward the needs of the population. When independence came, the transport infrastructure of most former colonies was structurally designed for extraction, not for the kind of internal economic integration that national development requires. In Africa, the Gold Coast, today's Ghana, became one of the world's largest gold producers under British rule. South Africa, also under British imperial control, produced nearly half of the world's gold around 1910 and almost all of its diamonds. The wealth this generated did not build Ghanaian or South African institutions, universities, or industries. It flowed to British shareholders, British banks, and the British Treasury. Kwame Nkrumah, writing in 1965, listed 9 of Britain's 20 largest monopolies as direct colonial extracting companies, including Shell, British Petroleum, British American Tobacco, and Imperial Tobacco. He documented that British profits from independent India had more than doubled after formal independence, and that British capital investment in India rose from 2,065 million rupees in 1948 to 4,460 million rupees in 1960. The empire had ended. The extraction had not. The mechanism that made post-independence extraction possible was debt. Colonial governments had borrowed money to build the infrastructure of extraction: railways, ports, administrative buildings, military installations. That debt was transferred to the independence governments along with formal sovereignty. The new nations inherited obligations to foreign creditors on the first day of their independence, meaning that a portion of every future year's tax revenue was already committed to servicing loans taken out by the colonial power that had just left. Jean-Paul Sartre coined the term neo-colonialism in 1956. Kwame Nkrumah developed it into a full political analysis in his 1965 book of the same name. The argument was precise. Formal independence without economic independence was not independence in any meaningful sense. A country whose single export commodity had its price set in London or New York, whose debt was held by European banks, whose currency was pegged to a former colonial power's exchange rate, and whose trade agreements required it to import manufactured goods from the same country that bought its raw materials. That country was not sovereign in any practical sense, regardless of what its flag looked like. The institutions that replaced direct colonial economic control were the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both established in 1944 at Bretton Woods, while most of the world was still under colonial rule. Both institutions were structured to give voting power proportional to financial contribution, meaning the wealthiest former colonial powers held permanent dominance over the decisions those institutions made. When newly independent countries faced economic crises frequently rooted in the extractive structures colonial rule had left behind, the IMF and World Bank provided loans conditioned on structural adjustment programs that required privatization of state assets, reduction of public services, and the opening of domestic markets to foreign competition. The conditions reliably benefited foreign investors and reliably damaged the domestic economic capacity of the borrowing country. The economic dependency the British Empire engineered did not require ongoing military occupation to maintain. It was baked into the trade relationships, the debt structures, the infrastructure orientation, and the institutional frameworks that independence governments inherited and that international financial institutions reinforced. The colony became a sovereign state. The economic relationship that defined the colony remained largely intact underneath. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Britain controlled populations through division, through proxy governance, through borders, through surveillance, through emergency law, through cultural engineering, through information management, and through economic dependency. But when all of those systems faced direct armed resistance, it needed one more tool, a way of fighting that appeared humane while achieving the same results as open brutality. Tactic 9: Hearts and Minds. Counterinsurgency. In April 1952, General Gerald Templer arrived in Malaya as the new High Commissioner and Director of Operations. Britain was 3 years into a communist insurgency it had not been able to suppress through military force alone. Templer looked at the situation and made a statement that would enter military doctrine permanently. The shooting side of this business, he said, is only 25% of the trouble. The other 75% lies in getting the people of this country behind us. That formulation, winning hearts and minds, became the intellectual foundation of counterinsurgency doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. It was borrowed, adapted, and cited by military planners in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
It was taught in war colleges. It was written into field manuals. And it originated in Britain's attempt to hold onto a colony that did not want to be held. The Malayan Emergency ran from 1948 to 1960. The Malayan Communist Party, composed largely of ethnic Chinese fighters who had resisted Japanese occupation during World War II with British support, launched an armed insurgency against colonial rule. The British response evolved through distinct phases. The first phase, from 1948 to roughly 1952, was primarily coercive. Security forces used free fire zones, collective punishment, mass arrests with indefinite detention, forced relocations of rural populations, and food controls designed to starve insurgents out of jungle territories. Approximately 500,000 rural Chinese Malayans were forcibly relocated into what the British called new villages, enclosed settlements surrounded by wire fencing and controlled entry points, to physically separate the population from the insurgents who depended on them for food and intelligence. This was not hearts and minds. This was population control enforced through coercion. The hearts and minds framing came later, in the second phase, when the back of the high-intensity insurgency had already been broken through those coercive methods. Templars' celebrated approach, medical aid, food provision, political concessions, promises of eventual independence, operated on a population that had already been physically controlled, surveilled, and in significant numbers detained. Academic research published in Small Wars and Insurgencies is direct on this point. The assumption that the Malayan campaign was turned primarily by winning hearts and minds is wrong. Population control and security came first. Persuasion followed once control was established. This distinction matters because the sanitized version of the Malayan model is what was exported to later conflicts.
American military planners studying British counterinsurgency doctrine took the hearts and minds framing at face value without fully accounting for the coercive foundation beneath it. John Nagel's book, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, which drew counterinsurgency lessons from Malaya and Vietnam, became a key text for American officers. General David Petraeus, who commanded U.S. forces in Iraq from February 2007, was directly influenced by British counterinsurgency doctrine. The result was the Counterinsurgency Field Manual 3-24, which the University of Chicago Press published and which became a bestseller, an unusual commercial achievement for a military manual. The Kenya Emergency, running from 1952 to 1960 and overlapping directly with Malaya, showed a starker version of the same approach. The British were suppressing the Mau Mau Uprising, a Kikuyu-led resistance movement against colonial land theft and political exclusion. The counterinsurgency involved mass detention without trial, systematic torture documented in subsequent legal cases, forced labor, collective punishment of entire villages, and the creation of a network of detention camps holding tens of thousands of people. Caroline Elkins, whose research won the Pulitzer Prize, documented in Britain's Gulag that the camp system was far larger and more brutal than official British accounts acknowledged. The British government settled a legal case brought by Kenyan survivors in 2013, paying out £19.9 million in compensation to 5,228 Kenyans who had suffered torture and abuse at British hands during the emergency. General Frank Kitson, who served in Malaya, Kenya, and Northern Ireland, became the British military's most influential theorist of counterinsurgency. His core argument was that there can be no such thing as a purely military solution, because insurgency is not primarily a military activity. Counterinsurgency doctrine therefore required civil-military cooperation, intelligence-led operations,
political engagement alongside security operations, and a unified command structure that prevented the military and civilian arms of government from working at cross purposes. These principles were written into British Army doctrine and remained influential for decades. Northern Ireland tested the model on a domestic population. From 1969 onward, British forces applied counterinsurgency techniques developed in colonial emergencies to a conflict within the United Kingdom itself. The problem, as documented in academic research on the period, was that the media access and legal accountability available in a domestic setting made the coercive methods that underpinned colonial counterinsurgency impossible to sustain invisibly. When internment without trial was introduced in August 1971, the abuse of detainees generated international condemnation. The Saville Inquiry, which investigated the Bloody Sunday killings of January 1972, concluded in 2010 that British soldiers had fired on unarmed civilians without justification. The tools that had functioned in distant colonies became catastrophically visible when applied at home. The core insight of Hearts and Minds doctrine, that controlling a population requires at minimum its passive acquiescence, and that generating that acquiescence through selective social investment is more sustainable than generating it through pure terror, is sound as military logic. What the British experience in Malaya, Kenya, and Northern Ireland collectively demonstrates is that the social investment component of the model was always layered on top of a coercive foundation, not substituted for it. Food aid and medical clinics were provided to populations already enclosed in controlled settlements. Political concessions were offered to movements that had already been militarily degraded. Every modern government that combines development assistance with military operations in contested territories, that builds schools and villages while running special forces operations in the same district, that funds community programs alongside surveillance and detention systems, is applying the same layered logic. The language is humanitarian. The architecture is colonial. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 9 of the 10 tactics that built and sustained the British Empire have now been accounted for. The last one is in some ways the most direct: the practice of fighting wars without appearing to fight them at all. Tactic 10: Proxy armies and native troops. At the height of World War I, over 1 million Indian soldiers were fighting for the British Empire. They served in France, Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Gallipoli, Palestine, East Africa, and West Africa. By the war's end, 74,000 of them were dead. They had no vote in the British Parliament. They had no say in the war's causes. They fought and died for an empire that classified them as subjects rather than citizens, and the territories they helped defend were not theirs. This was not exceptional. It was the entire model. The British Empire was never primarily a British military operation. From its earliest years, the empire was fought for, garrisoned, and maintained by the people it had conquered. The cost in British lives and British money was kept manageable by ensuring that colonial populations bore the overwhelming share of both. The sepoys of the East India Company were among the earliest and most documented examples. By the mid-18th century, the company was directly recruiting Indian infantry soldiers, organizing them into presidency armies covering Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. These forces carried out the conquest that expanded British control across the subcontinent. The British officers directed, the Indian soldiers bled. The 1857 rebellion changed the composition, but not the principle. After suppressing the uprising, the British restructured the Indian Army around what they called the martial races doctrine. This was a pseudoscientific racial theory that designated certain ethnic and religious groups, Sikhs, Gurkhas, Punjabi Muslims, Pathans, Rajputs, Baloch, as naturally suited to military service, while dismissing others, particularly educated urban Bengalis, as effeminate and unreliable. The theory was not based on evidence. It was based on which communities had remained loyal during the 1857 rebellion and which had joined it. The British rewarded loyalty with military recruitment and the status and income that came with it, creating a structural incentive for specific communities to tie their material interests to the continuation of British rule. By the Second World War, the Indian Army had become the largest volunteer army in recorded history. Approximately 2.5 million Indian soldiers served between 1939 and 1945. India itself functioned as a key logistical base for Allied operations across Asia and the Middle East. The financial cost of maintaining this force was charged to the Indian colonial budget, meaning Indian tax revenue paid for Indian soldiers fighting Britain's wars in other people's countries. In Africa, the British built parallel structures. The King's African Rifles was consolidated in 1902 from several existing colonial units, drawing African soldiers from Kenya, Uganda, Nyasaland, and Tanganyika under white British officers. By the end of World War I, the King's African Rifles comprised over 30,000 African soldiers and had fought campaigns across East Africa and into Mozambique. The West African Frontier Force performed equivalent functions across Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. Both forces recruited heavily from communities the British had designated as martial races in the African context, groups from the margins of colonial territories whose economic position made military service attractive and whose distance from colonial political centers made them less likely to develop nationalist sympathies. The ethnic engineering built into these forces had consequences that outlasted the empire entirely. Research published through Stanford University documents that the King's African Rifles and the West African Frontier Force formed the direct basis for the independent armies of Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. The new governments inherited the soldiers, the officers, the command structures, and the ethnic compositions of the colonial forces wholesale. The rank and file were drawn from communities the British had specifically selected for military loyalty, which meant they were not representative of the broader national populations the armies were now supposed to serve. The officer corps reflected the communities that had received missionary education under colonial rule, because literacy and English language skills were prerequisites for commissioned rank. The Stanford research found a direct statistical relationship between these inherited ethnic imbalances and political instability. When post-independence governments took actions that threatened the interests of communities heavily represented in the officer corps, military coups followed. When the officer corps was drawn from communities the government was not actively threatening, coups did not occur. The British had built armies designed to serve colonial interests. Those armies then shaped the political histories of independent nations in ways that directly reflected the choices British recruiters had made decades earlier. The Gurkhas represent perhaps the most durable surviving expression of the proxy army model. Nepalese Gurkha soldiers have served in the British Army continuously since 1816, following a treaty signed after the Anglo-Nepalese War. They fought in both world wars, in the Falklands in 1982, in Bosnia, in East Timor, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. They are celebrated within British military culture for exceptional loyalty and fighting capability. For most of their service history, Gurkha soldiers received significantly lower pay and pensions than their British counterparts performing identical roles. A legal campaign fought over several years finally resulted in a 2009 ruling allowing Gurkhas who had served before 1997 to settle in Britain, a right their British colleagues had always held automatically. The proxy warfare principle did not end with formal decolonization. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union both fought extensively through local forces, arming, training, and directing proxy armies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America rather than deploying their own soldiers at scale. The logic was identical to what the British had practiced for centuries: achieve military objectives while minimizing the domestic political cost of casualties. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan received American weapons and training to fight Soviet forces through the 1980s. Multiple African civil wars were fought by forces supplied and directed by external powers who never formally declared war. Today, special forces training missions, military assistance programs, security sector reform initiatives, and arms sales to allied governments all operate on the same foundational principle. The fighting is done by local forces. The strategic direction, the equipment, the training doctrine, and frequently the intelligence come from outside. The local soldiers take the casualties. The external power achieves the objective. 10 tactics, 1 empire. And every single one of them still running somewhere in the world right now under different names, different flags,
and different justifications. Because the technology of control does not expire when the empire that perfected it does. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.